Melissa Carter shoved her hand deeper into the dumpster, and her fingers closed around something soft. Bread. 2 days passed rotten fuzzy at the edges, but bread. Behind her, her 5-year-old son was crouched in the gravel, pressing an empty ketchup packet to his lips and sucking the last trace of red off the plastic. She didn't look away fast enough. She saw it. And something inside her chest cracked down the middle like sun-dried wood. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Every share, every comment, every new subscriber keeps stories like Melissa's alive. Now let's begin. The summer of 1987 came down on West Texas like punishment. Not the kind of heat that makes people complain and reach for sweet tea. The kind that kills livestock. The kind that cracks the earth open and turns dirt roads into powder and makes the air above the asphalt shimmer like a fever dream. The kind that doesn't apologize. Melissa Carter had stopped apologizing a long time ago, too. Not for her size, not for her situation, not for the 3 children who followed her like shadows through every bad decision life had made for her. She'd stopped explaining herself to people who never planned to understand her anyway. What she hadn't stopped doing, what she absolutely could not stop doing, was feeding those children. Emma was 12 and already carried the weight of a grown woman on her shoulders. She stood with her back against the brick wall of the diner, arms crossed, watching the back door, like she was calculating the risk of every single person who might walk through it. She had her mama's dark eyes and her daddy's stubbornness, but none of her daddy's tendency to disappear when things got hard. Emma never disappeared. She planted her feet and stayed. Sophie was 8 and still soft around the edges in the way that 8-year-olds are when they haven't yet learned to armor themselves against the world. She sat on her knees in the gravel, picking at the hem of her dress, her lips moving like she was praying, or maybe just counting. She did that sometimes. Made up numbers, made up rules. If I count to 100, something good will happen. If I don't step on a crack, Mama will find food today. Ben was 5. Ben was just hungry. Mama. His voice came out small and flat, not whining. He'd learned not to whine because whining made Emma's jaw go tight and made Sophie start counting faster and made Mama's shoulders do that thing where they pulled up toward her ears like she was bracing for a blow. Mama, my tummy hurts again. Melissa pulled the bread out of the dumpster. She turned it over in her hands without letting herself think too hard about what she was doing. There was a time not so long ago, though it felt like another lifetime, when she would have thrown this bread away herself. When she would have scraped half-eaten food off a dinner plate and dropped it in the trash without a second thought the way everyone inside this diner was doing right now. She could hear them through the screen door. Laughter. The scrape of forks. A woman complaining her biscuits weren't flaky enough. "I know, baby," she said. She broke the bread carefully, pulling the worst of the mold away, trying not to let Ben see how much she was removing before she handed him the rest. "Here. Eat slow." He took it with both hands, like she'd handed him something precious. And she supposed she had. "There's more in there," Emma said quietly, pushing off the wall and coming to stand beside her. She didn't ask permission, just reached past her mother's arm and felt around inside the dumpster with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had made peace with doing whatever needed doing. "Looks like half a pie. Peach, maybe." "Emma." "Mama." Emma looked at her directly, and Melissa hated how much older those eyes looked than 12. "Ben's been awake 2 nights crying from hunger pains. Don't tell me no." Melissa closed her mouth, opened it again, closed it. Emma pulled out the pie tin, most of the crust broken, the filling congealed and dark at the edges, but not spoiled, not yet. She set it on the ground and broke it into portions with the clean efficiency she applied to every ugly task life handed her. Sophie stopped counting and came forward. Nobody said anything while they ate. That was the hardest part, Melissa thought. Not the eating, not the shame of it, even though the shame was there sitting on her chest like something physical. The hardest part was the silence. The way her children had stopped commenting on what they ate. The way they had stopped asking why. Children shouldn't be that quiet about food. Children should squabble over the last biscuit and refuse to eat their peas and demand dessert when they hadn't finished dinner. Her children ate whatever appeared in front of them without a word, and that silence was the loudest sound Melissa Carter had ever heard in her life. She was still thinking about that silence when the back door of the diner opened. She didn't startle. She'd learned not to startle in places like this. Startling looked guilty, and she wasn't guilty of anything except poverty, and she was damned if she'd apologize for that too. She just straightened up, kept her face neutral, and prepared for whoever it was to tell her to get away from their trash. The man who came through the door was tall, not in a showy way, not the kind of tall that announced itself, just tall the way old fence posts are tall, lean and weathered, and absolutely fixed in place. He was carrying 2 large feed buckets, one in each hand, and he stopped when he saw them. His eyes moved across the scene quickly. Melissa, the 3 children, the pie tin on the ground, Ben, with both hands still wrapped around his piece of bread. Melissa lifted her chin. The man set his buckets down slowly. He looked at Ben's face, at the ketchup stains on the boy's shirt from where he'd been sucking the packets. His jaw moved once like he was chewing something that wasn't food. Then he looked at Melissa and his voice came out low and level without judgment, without the particular brand of pity that made a person feel smaller than they already did. "Ma'am, no child should eat like that in America." Melissa's jaw tightened. "I ain't asking for your opinion, sir." "No, ma'am, you weren't." He crouched down to Ben's level, without making a production of it, a smooth, easy movement, the kind of man who'd spent his whole life getting low to the ground to look at small things. "Hey, partner, what's your name?" Ben looked at his mother first. She gave the smallest nod. "Ben," the boy said. "Ben." The man nodded seriously like this was important information. "How old are you, Ben?" 5. 5 years old and already handling himself out here in the July heat. That's something. He straightened back up and looked at Melissa again. "I got a ranch about 6 miles out. I got food. Real food, I mean cooked hot enough of it. I got 3 empty bunk cabins sitting there right now, not doing a thing for nobody. I got well water and clean beds." He paused. "I ain't looking for anything in return. I want to say that plain before you decide what to think of me." Emma stepped forward immediately. "Then why would you offer—" The man looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, more like adjusted, like a man recalibrating to a harder edge than he expected from a 12-year-old. "Because it's the right thing," he said simply. "That's all I got." Emma stared at him. "What's your name?" "Cole Bennett." "You live alone out there, Mr. Bennett?" "I do." "And you got no wife? No other people on your property?" "I got 2 ranch hands. Older fellow's been with me 15 years, that's all." Emma turned to her mother. The look on her face said, "Your call." But I've heard his answers. Melissa hadn't moved. She was watching Cole Bennett with the careful stillness of a woman who had learned that the speed with which a man offered kindness often correlated precisely with the speed with which he'd later present his bill. She'd met men like that. Too many of them. Men who opened doors with one hand and held the invoice behind their back with the other. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully. "We'll manage." Cole Bennett nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't try harder. He simply picked his feed buckets back up and said, "All right then," and went back toward his truck parked at the side of the building. They watched him go. Ben looked up at his mother with peach filling on his chin and asked, "Why didn't we go?" "Eat your bread," Melissa said. But she watched that truck until it pulled out onto the highway and disappeared in the shimmer of summer heat, and something in her chest moved in a way she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. The problem with surviving, she had learned, is that it requires you to be suspicious of everything that doesn't look like survival. Kindness starts to look like a trap. Safety starts to look like a lie you tell yourself right before something catastrophic happens. She had trained herself to walk past good things because every good thing she'd ever reached for had turned into something else entirely. Her husband's name was Dale Carter, and he had reached for her when she was 22 years old, with the biggest smile she'd ever seen on a human face, and promises that came out of his mouth like they cost him nothing. He'd promised her a house. He'd promised her stability. He'd promised her that no matter what happened, no matter how rough things got, he would never leave those children without a father. Oklahoma had been his idea. There was oil work out there, good money cash under the table for men who didn't ask too many questions. He'd kissed her forehead and kissed each of the children, and driven away in a truck that needed new tires, and told her he'd send money inside 2 weeks. That was 14 months ago. After 6 months with no word and no money, the landlord had stopped accepting apologies. After 8 months, she had sold everything she could sell. After 10 months, she had started doing things she wasn't proud of. And after 12 months, she had packed what was left of their lives into 2 garbage bags and walked out of the only home her children had ever known, with nowhere particular to go. They had drifted for 2 months now, town to town, whatever work she could find. She was a big woman and she'd never pretended otherwise, 5'4" and well over 250 pounds, with strong hands and a broad back and a face that would have been beautiful under different circumstances and was still striking even now. She could work. She'd always been able to work. But the kind of work available to a woman who looked like her with 3 children trailing behind in a Texas economy that was bleeding jobs the same way the earth was bleeding water in this drought wasn't always enough to cover both a roof and 3 hungry mouths. More often than not, she chose the hungry mouths. The diner they were behind now had turned her away that morning. The woman at the back door had looked at her with the particular expression Melissa had cataloged by now in her private mental file of looks. She'd been given the upper lip, barely moving the eyes, doing a quick inventory. The decision made before a single word was spoken. Too big. Too burdened. Too much. "We don't have openings," the woman had said, already closing the door. Emma had heard it. Sophie had heard it. Ben was too young to understand the exact mechanics of what had happened, but he could read the air pressure the way all young children can, and he'd reached up and taken Melissa's hand without being asked. That was 3 hours ago. Since then, they'd sat in the shade of the dumpster and waited for the lunch rush to end so they could see what the kitchen threw away. Now the sun was past its worst, but the heat hadn't broken, and Sophie had fallen asleep against the brick wall with her mouth open, and Ben was dozing against his sister's shoulder, and Emma was watching her mother with those old woman eyes, and Melissa was thinking about a tall man in a battered hat who hadn't tried too hard and hadn't looked at her the way men usually looked at her, which was either with contempt or with a particular kind of hunger that made her want to put herself between it and her daughters. Cole Bennett had just looked at Ben's face and said, "No child should eat like that." "Mama," Emma said quietly, so she wouldn't wake the little ones. "We got nowhere to sleep tonight." "I know. The Hannigan Motor Inn said no when we didn't have cash up front." "I know, Emma. The church over on 7th Street, the one with the red door. I already tried the churches." Melissa's voice came out flat. She hadn't meant it to. "Baby, I already tried everything in this town today, before you were up this morning." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, "He didn't look at you the wrong way." Melissa looked at her daughter sharply. "Mr. Bennett," Emma clarified in the voice of a girl who had already learned to pay attention to the things women pay attention to. "He didn't look at you like most men look at you. He looked at Ben. I noticed." "So did I." Emma pulled her knees up to her chest. "I reckon a man who looks at a hungry 5-year-old before he looks at anything else is probably the kind of man he said he was." Melissa stared at her eldest child for a long moment, 12 years old and reading men like a field guide. "When did you get so smart?" she asked. Emma didn't smile. "When Daddy left." The words sat between them without needing elaboration. Cole Bennett's ranch was 6 miles out. The highway was right there. She had 2 children asleep and 1 awake, and no money and no roof, and enough pride left to be fully aware of exactly what it would mean to walk back to that road and try to flag down a man she'd already turned down once. It would mean admitting she'd been wrong. And Melissa Carter had spent a year and 2 months being wrong about everything, so she reckoned one more admission wasn't going to break what was left of her. She touched Sophie's shoulder gently. "Wake up, baby." Sophie stirred. Are we moving again? We're going somewhere, Melissa said carefully. Somewhere with real food and a bed. Ben lifted his head from Emma's shoulder, immediately alert, the way hungry children are when food is mentioned. Real food. Real food, Ben. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Emma stood and brushed the gravel dust off her dress, and she didn't say "I told you so" because that wasn't who Emma was. But her mother could see the relief in her shoulders, that slight dropping of weight that shouldn't be there in a 12-year-old. And it made Melissa's throat tighten in a way she didn't allow herself to show. She picked up the 2 garbage bags that held everything they owned and started walking toward the highway. Behind the diner, the dumpster sat with its lid open in the heat. She didn't look back at it. Cole Bennett's truck was easy to spot. It was the only one pulled to the road shoulder about a quarter-mile out, engine idling. The man himself sitting on the hood with his hat pushed back, looking at nothing in particular. The way a man looks when he's waiting without wanting to seem like he's waiting. When he saw them coming up the road, he didn't jump up or make a fuss. He just slid off the hood, walked to the passenger side and opened the door. Pulled the bench seat forward to make room in the back, waited. Melissa stopped a few feet from him. I need to say something first, she said. Yes, ma'am. I got 3 children. They are my first, last, and only priority in this world. Anything that threatens them, any situation that feels wrong, any moment where my instincts tell me something is off, I will take those children and I will leave without explanation and without apology. You understand that? Cole looked her in the eye. Yes, ma'am. I'd expect nothing less from a mother worth her salt. I am not looking for charity that comes with conditions attached. I understand. And I am not looking for... She stopped, recalibrated. I am not looking for anything except safety for my children. That's all I'm accepting. That's all I'm offering, Cole said. Nothing more, nothing less. She studied his face for a long moment. Then she stepped aside so the children could climb in first. Ben scrambled up onto the bench seat and pressed his face to the window immediately, like there was something out there he'd been waiting his whole life to see. Sophie climbed in carefully, folding herself small out of long habit. Emma got in last, sat up straight, and fixed Cole with a look that said plainly, I'm watching you. Melissa got in and pulled the door shut. Cole walked around the front of the truck, got in behind the wheel, and pulled out onto the highway without ceremony. They drove in silence for a while. The flat Texas landscape moved past the windows, bleached and cracked and relentless in the heat. Then Ben said from the back seat with the startling directness of a 5-year-old, Mr. Cole, do you got eggs? Cole glanced in the rearview mirror. I do. Real ones from chickens. Got about 30 chickens. They lay eggs every day whether I want 'em to or not. Ben turned this information over with great seriousness. Could I see them, the chickens? Ben, Emma said. It's all right, Cole said. Yes, partner, you can see the chickens. Ben sat back apparently satisfied that the most important question had been answered and looked out the window again. Melissa stared straight ahead at the highway. She did not let herself feel the thing she was feeling, which was something terrifyingly close to relief. Relief was dangerous. Relief made you let your guard down. Relief was the thing she'd felt the morning Dale kissed her forehead and drove away in a truck with bald tires and a full tank of promises. But in the back seat, her children were sitting in an air-conditioned truck for the first time in months, and Ben was asking about chickens with the voice of a boy who had briefly, tentatively, allowed himself to believe that something good might happen. She could not afford to take that away from him tonight. So she folded her hands in her lap and watched the highway unspool ahead of them, and she let herself be carried just for now, just for tonight, toward whatever came next. The ranch appeared on the horizon, the way things appear in Texas. Summer heat gradually, then all at once. A house, several outbuildings, a barn with a weathered red roof, a water tower, fencing that stretched out in either direction as far as she could see with cattle standing in clusters wherever the shade fell. Sophie pressed her face to the window beside her brother and whispered, It's big. Yep, Cole said simply. You live here all alone. A pause. just a beat too long. "I do now," he said. Melissa filed that away without comment. He pulled up in front of the main house and cut the engine. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ben had the door open and both feet on the ground before anyone could stop him, turning in a slow circle, taking in the yard, with his arms slightly out from his sides like he was trying to measure the space. "Chickens," he said, looking at Cole. "Round the back," Cole said. "Give me 10 minutes to get the house open and I'll take you." Ben nodded gravely. This was a fair deal. Cole took the 2 garbage bags from Melissa before she could protest. Not roughly, not with any show of it, just lifted them out of her hands with a natural ease, the way a man does when he's used to carrying things and doesn't think twice about it, and walked up the porch steps. Melissa stood in the yard for a moment with the late afternoon sun on her back and her children already beginning to spread out in tentative arcs around her, Emma examining the porch railing with careful fingers. Sophie crouching to look at something in the dust. Ben inching toward the sound of chickens with barely restrained urgency. She had been wrong before. She could be wrong about this. But she followed him up the steps anyway. The inside of the house was clean, in a particular way, not decorated, not arranged with any eye for comfort, but genuinely clean, the kind of clean that a single person maintains out of habit or discipline rather than domesticity. There were dishes stacked neatly in the drain rack. There was a worn but scrubbed kitchen table with 4 chairs, and Melissa noted without meaning to that there were only 4 chairs, as if the table had been waiting for exactly this configuration. Cole set her garbage bags down by the door and turned to face her. "I'll put on the stove," he said. "I got beans soaking since this morning, and I can fry up potatoes, and there's cornbread I made yesterday. It ain't fancy." "It's more than we've had," Melissa said. She hadn't meant to say that out loud. He didn't react to it, and she was grateful for that. Just turned to the stove and got to work. She stood in his kitchen doorway and watched him move, competent, unhurried, the way people move when they know their own spaces intimately, and she tried to locate the angle, catch the thing underneath the thing that would eventually reveal itself and prove her instincts right. She couldn't find it. That scared her more than anything else had all day. Behind her, through the screen door, she could hear Ben's voice rising in pure, uncomplicated delight as he discovered the chickens and Sophie's laughter following close behind. And for just a moment, the sound of it moved through her like water through cracked ground. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe and breathed. "You can sit down, ma'am," Cole said from the stove without turning around. "You don't have to stand guard over everything." "Force of habit," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "I reckon it is." She looked at the back of his head, at his shoulders moving easily as he worked over the stove, at the particular set of a man who had learned to exist in a space without filling it up too much. And she sat down at the table. That was all it was that first night. Just a woman sitting down at a table in a stranger's kitchen while her children laughed somewhere outside, and something that smelled like real food cooked on the stove. But for Melissa Carter in the summer of 1987, after 14 months of holding everything up by herself in the Texas heat, sitting down at a table felt like the most dangerous and necessary thing she had ever done. The beans were the best thing Ben had ever eaten in his life, and he said so 4 times. Nobody corrected him. Nobody told him that was hyperbole, or that he needed to eat slower, or that saying something 4 times was excessive. Cole just refilled his bowl without being asked, and Sophie held her own bowl out immediately after, and even Emma, who had spent the entire meal watching Cole from across the table, with the focused attention of a courtroom witness, finished every bite, and then looked at the cornbread like she was working up the courage to ask for more. "Go ahead," Cole said without looking up from his own plate. Emma hesitated. "I didn't say anything." "No, ma'am. But you've been staring at that cornbread for 2 minutes and you got the look of someone doing math in their head." He slid the pan across the table. "Ain't nothing to calculate here. There's enough." Emma took a piece. Then she looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Why are you being kind to us?" The table went quiet. Sophie stopped chewing. Ben looked up from his bowl. Cole set his fork down and gave the question the weight it deserved. He didn't rush his answer. Didn't reach for something easy or practiced. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said finally. Cancer. We never had children, though we wanted them, and I have thought every single day since she passed about what she would have done today if she'd walked out that back door of that diner instead of me." He picked his fork back up. "So I reckon I'm not being kind. I'm just doing what Margaret would have done, and it helps me sleep." Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her mother. Melissa was looking at her plate. After dinner, Cole showed them the 2 bunk cabins nearest the main house. Clean plain, wood-framed rooms with narrow beds and thin but washed blankets and a single window in each. He'd already put fresh water in the pitchers without being asked. Ben walked in, looked around, once climbed directly into the nearest bed, with his boots still on, and was asleep in under 4 minutes. Sophie stood in the doorway of the second cabin and said quietly, "Will the door lock from the inside?" Cole looked at her. "Yes, miss. There's a bolt on the inside of every cabin door. Always has been." Sophie nodded, went inside, slid the bolt. Emma was the last one standing in the yard with Melissa. She crossed her arms and looked up at her mother. "I'm sleeping in your cabin tonight." "Emma." "I'm not asking." Emma said simply. "I'm telling." Melissa looked at her daughter for a long moment. The girl who hadn't been 12 for more than 6 months, but carried 12 years like a woman carries decades. The girl who had appointed herself her family's last line of defense and hadn't once stood down from that post. "All right," Melissa said softly. "Come on then." She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay in the narrow bunk with Emma's breathing steady beside her, and she stared at the ceiling, and she catalogued every sound the ranch made. The cattle shifting, something moving in the barn. The distant call of something she couldn't name, and she waited for the thing that was going to go wrong. Nothing went wrong. That was almost worse. That was. Morning came in hard and hot through the single window, and she was already up and dressed by the time she heard boots on the porch of the main house. She opened the cabin door and found Cole on the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee, holding one out in her direction without ceremony. She crossed the yard and took it. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I sleep fine," she said. He looked at her sideways over the rim of his cup. "Yes, ma'am." She drank the coffee. It was strong and real, and she couldn't remember the last time someone had handed her something without being asked. She turned that thought over carefully and then put it somewhere she didn't plan to visit again right away. "I'd like to work," she said. "I don't stay anywhere. I don't pull my weight." "I figured you'd say something like that. What do you need done?" He thought about it seriously, the way he seemed to think about most things without performance, just genuine consideration. "My 2 hands, Earl and Dub, they've been eating out of cans since Margaret passed. I can't cook worth a damn myself. 3 ranch hands and we're all 20 pounds lighter than we should be, and Earl's got a bad back and can't stand at a stove. If you're willing to cook for the house, that's more than fair trade for the cabin and the meals." Melissa looked at him. "That's not an equal trade." "Well, that's my offer. I'll cook and I'll clean the cabins and I'll do laundry. That's a fair trade." Cole opened his mouth. "I'm not negotiating, Mr. Bennett," she said. He closed his mouth. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The first week passed like that in negotiations that weren't really negotiations, in careful distances maintained in the slow establishment of territory and routine. Melissa cooked breakfast before the sun was fully up. She cooked dinner in the late afternoon. In between, she cleaned and mended and reorganized the kitchen with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had run a household for years and never lost the instinct for it, even when she'd lost everything else. Earl was 63 and moved like a man whose body had filed a formal complaint with every joint it contained. He had kind eyes and the manners of someone who'd had a good mother and remembered it. He called Melissa Miss Mel from the second day onward and asked her every morning if she'd slept well, and she always said yes, and he always nodded like he believed her, and somehow that small fiction was its own kind of courtesy. Dub was younger, maybe 50, and spoke approximately 12 words per day, total, but distributed them thoughtfully. He brought firewood to the kitchen door without being asked, and fixed the hinge on the cabin door that had been sticking, and left a bar of soap on Sophie's windowsill one morning with no explanation whatsoever. Sophie found the soap and showed it to Ben with great ceremony. "Somebody left me a present," she said. "That was Dub," Ben said authoritatively. He had already become Dub's shadow and had appointed himself the man's unofficial interpreter with the confidence only a 5-year-old can sustain. "How do you know?" Sophie asked. "Because I asked him why the hinge was making noise, and he said soap, and then he left." Ben shrugged. "He means things." It was Emma who watched Cole most closely with the patience of a scientist, observing something she hadn't classified yet. She watched how he spoke to his horses low and direct, no baby talk, treating them like animals who deserved the truth about what was happening to them. She watched how he handled a disagreement with a supplier over the phone, steady, precise, no bluster, resolving it in 7 minutes without raising his voice once. She watched how he noticed things. A loose board on the porch that she'd been stepping over. He replaced it the same day she'd first tripped on it. He hadn't asked anyone about it, he'd just seen it. She came to her mother one evening while Melissa was washing up after dinner. "He notices things," Emma said by way of preamble. Melissa kept washing. "I know. He noticed that Sophie doesn't eat well if she's anxious, so he started telling her what's for dinner in the morning so she has time to get used to it." Melissa's hands stilled in the wash water. "He noticed that Ben favors his left hand but keeps reaching for things with his right," Emma continued. "He asked me yesterday if Ben had ever been told not to use his left hand. I said yes, his kindergarten teacher. Cole said that was ignorant, and he was going to teach Ben to rope left-handed." Melissa turned around. He said, and I am quoting exactly, "That boy's got a natural pull in his left hand, and there ain't a thing in this world wrong with that." Emma looked at her mother steadily. "He pays attention, Mama, the way Daddy never did." The words landed the way true things land, not like a slap, but like weight settling. Melissa dried her hands on her apron and didn't answer for a moment because she was working to keep her face where she needed it to be. "That doesn't mean anything," she said finally. "A man can pay attention for a week." Emma looked at her. "How long does he have to pay attention before it means something?" Melissa had no answer for that. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat on the cabin step in the dark and let herself think about Dale for the first time in a long time. Not the good version of Dale, the one she'd constructed in the early months of his absence out of desperation and love. The version where he'd meant well, where Oklahoma had been a genuine plan, where something had happened to him out there that wasn't his fault. She thought about the real Dale, the one who had looked at her across the dinner table in the good years, with a kind of mild surprise like he kept forgetting she was there, and was vaguely pleased to be reminded. The one who had told her once after too much beer at a friend's 4th of July party that he'd married her because she seemed like the type who'd stick. Not because she was beautiful. Not because he loved her. Because she seemed like the type who'd stick. She had stuck. She had stuck through the drinking which came and went in seasons. She had stuck through the debts which multiplied the way debt always does when the person generating it never looks directly at it. She had stuck through 14 months of silence and hunger, and her children eating garbage behind diners in Texas heat. She had stuck. And she was still here, and Dale was somewhere. Oklahoma, presumably. Or past Oklahoma. Or nowhere she could find him, even if she tried. The screen door of the main house opened and Cole came out onto the porch. He stopped when he saw her. "Didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," she said. He leaned against the porch railing and looked at the sky. She'd noticed he did this most nights, came outside after the house was settled, and stood there quietly, like a man making sure everything was still in its proper place. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Does it get easier? Being alone in a house that used to have somebody else in it?" A long pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "No," he said. "But you get used to the shape of it, like a missing tooth. You stop reaching for it eventually." She thought about that. Margaret, she was happy here on the ranch. "She built this kitchen herself," Cole said. "Designed every inch of it, drove to San Antonio twice to get the right materials. She was the kind of woman who made things right with her hands. She wasn't happy sitting still." He paused. "She would have liked you, Melissa looked up at him sharply. He was looking at the sky. She always said she wanted women around who didn't apologize for taking up space. He said quietly. She'd have liked your Emma, too. She'd have said that girl is going somewhere. Melissa felt something move in her chest that she absolutely could not afford to feel right now, and she stood up abruptly. Good night, Mr. Bennett. Good night, ma'am. She went inside and bolted the door and pressed her back against it in the dark and breathed very carefully for a long time. 2 weeks became 3, 3 became 4. Ben learned to rope left-handed and came to dinner every night talking about it in precise and passionate detail, and Cole listened every time like it was new information, asking questions, taking the boy seriously. And Melissa watched that from across the table and told herself it was just a kind man doing a kind thing, and it didn't mean what it felt like. Then the afternoon, everything shifted. She was in the kitchen when she heard Sophie screaming, not the sharp, startled scream of a child who's been surprised, the raw, thin, high scream of genuine terror. Melissa was through the back door before she'd made any conscious decision to move, crossing the yard in a dead run, moving faster than a woman her size was supposed to be able to move. Her heart hammering so hard, she felt it in her throat. She rounded the corner of the barn and stopped. Sophie was pressed against the fence, pale and rigid, staring at a coiled shape in the dust 3 feet from her left boot. A rattlesnake. Thick and settled, and deeply unhappy about whatever had disturbed it. And between Sophie and the snake, crouched low and moving with absolute stillness, was Cole. He had a long-handled shovel in his hands. He'd come from somewhere, the barn, the tool shed. Melissa didn't know and didn't care. He was there. He was between her daughter and that snake, and he was moving with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes from a man who has dealt with this exact situation enough times to know exactly what he's doing. Sophie, he said without taking his eyes off the snake, don't move your feet. Sophie made a sound that wasn't a word. I know, he said. I got you. Don't move. One motion, flat and certain and fast. The shovel came down and it was over, and Cole straightened up and turned to Sophie and said simply, Come here. Sophie crossed those 3 feet in one step and grabbed him around the middle with both arms and pressed her face into his side and shook. Cole put one hand on the back of her head. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and held on until she stopped shaking, and Melissa stood at the corner of the barn and watched her 8-year-old daughter hold on to a man who had stepped between her and a rattlesnake without a second thought. And she felt something in her chest that had been locked for over a year turn over like an engine finding its rhythm. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Emma appeared beside her out of nowhere, silent as she always was, and looked at the scene and then looked at her mother's face and said nothing at all for once. When Sophie finally let go, her face was splotchy and her nose was running, and she looked at Cole with a directness that was pure, uncomplicated, and devastating. Thank you, she said. Yes, ma'am, Cole said. Like she was someone whose thanks mattered. Like she was a full person who had given him something real. Sophie wiped her nose on her sleeve. You scared me worse than the snake when you ran past me with that shovel. Cole looked at her seriously. I apologize for that. Sophie considered. I forgive you, she said, because you killed it. The corner of Cole's mouth moved, just barely, the closest thing to a smile Melissa had seen on him. She turned and walked back to the kitchen before he could look up and see whatever was on her face. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the pot on the stove, and she gripped it hard and made herself breathe and told herself for the 100th time since she'd arrived at this ranch that she did not have the luxury of feeling any of the things she was feeling. Because the last time she'd let herself feel safe, she'd been standing in the doorway of a house that wasn't hers 6 weeks later. The last time she'd let herself need someone, she'd watched a truck with bald tires disappear down a highway and never come back. Emma came in the back door behind her and sat at the kitchen table without preamble. Mama, she said. Don't. I'm just going to say one thing. Emma, you're allowed to let someone be good to us. Emma's voice was steady and quiet and utterly relentless. You are actually allowed to let that happen. Melissa kept her back to her daughter. Go wash up for dinner. Mama? Emma Carter, go wash up for dinner. A long silence, then the scrape of a chair. At the door, Emma stopped. He ran, she said. He heard Sophie scream, and he ran, not walked, not looked around to figure out what was happening. He ran. She went out. Melissa stood at the stove and stared at the wall and thought about a man running toward the sound of her daughter's fear without stopping to calculate the cost of it, and she felt for the first time in 14 months something she absolutely refused to name sitting quiet and alive in the center of her chest. Outside, Ben was yelling about the snake. Sophie was correcting his version of events loudly. Cole's low voice came in occasionally, keeping them both honest. The kitchen smelled like beans and cornbread, and the particular kind of ordinary that Melissa Carter had stopped believing she would ever find again. She stood in it for a moment. Then she put supper on the table. 5 weeks in, Melissa stopped locking the cabin door at night. She didn't make a decision about it. Didn't sit down and reason through the implications, or weigh the risks, the way she'd been weighing everything since the moment Cole Bennett had handed her a cup of coffee on a porch steps at sunrise. She just realized one morning, reaching for the bolt out of habit, that her hand didn't close around it, that her body had decided something her mind was still arguing about. She left it unlocked. Went to sleep. Woke up fine. It was such a small thing, it felt enormous. The ranch had found its rhythm around them the way living things find rhythms, not by anyone deciding how it should go, but by the slow accumulation of days, until a pattern emerged that felt, if not inevitable, then at least real. Melissa cooked. Earl and Dub ate like men who had been quietly starving and were deeply grateful to no longer be doing so. Earl had started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill every few days, a gesture so purely courteous and old-fashioned that Melissa couldn't look at them without feeling something loosen in her chest. Ben had become Cole's shadow in the mornings, the same way he'd become Dub's shadow in the afternoons, dividing his loyalties with the pragmatic efficiency of a 5-year-old who has identified where the best information lives. From Cole, he was learning horses and ropes and the names of every tool in the barn. From Dub, he was learning that silence is its own kind of language, and that a man who doesn't talk much is often saying more than the men who never stop. Sophie had started singing again. Melissa heard it one morning through the thin cabin wall, soft and tuneless, the kind of humming a child does when she's forgotten to be careful, when she's let her guard down all the way. She sat on the edge of her bunk and listened to it for a full minute before she trusted herself to move. Emma was harder to read. Emma was always harder to read. But Melissa had noticed her daughter lingering after dinner some nights, sitting at the table with Cole, while the others cleared out, asking him questions about the ranch, about cattle prices, about what happens to a town when the water table drops and the drought doesn't break. Cole answered all of it straight, without talking down, without the particular condescension adults sometimes aimed at smart children, as a way of protecting themselves from how uncomfortable it is to be outpaced. He talked to Emma like she was a person whose questions deserved real answers. One evening, Melissa walked back into the kitchen for a forgotten dish towel and found them bent over a ledger together, Cole explaining margins, Emma asking about the difference between what a ranch looked like on paper versus what it looked like in practice. She backed out quietly before either of them saw her. She stood outside the door for a moment. Then she went back to her cabin and sat on her bunk and told herself very firmly that what she was feeling was gratitude. Gratitude was safe. Gratitude didn't require anything from her. Gratitude was something you could set down and walk away from when the time came. She was still telling herself that when the truck came up the drive. It was a Tuesday. Late morning, the heat already climbing toward its worst. Melissa was in the kitchen when she heard the engine, not Cole's truck, not Earl's, rattling pickup. Something heavier. Something that idled with a particular kind of authority that made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up before she'd processed any conscious reason why. She went to the kitchen window. 2 men. Dark truck, no ranch markings. The one who got out on the driver's side was big, not ranch hand big, not the kind of big that comes from physical labor, but the deliberate big of a man who has cultivated his size as a professional tool. The one who came around the passenger side was smaller and moved with the particular looseness of someone who has learned to be comfortable in situations other people find dangerous. They weren't from around here. Everything about them said it. Cole came out of the barn. She watched him read them the same way she'd read them, the slight change in how he stood, the feet planting a little wider, nothing dramatic, nothing telegraphed. Just a man getting his footing. "Help you," she heard him say through the window glass, his voice carrying the flat courtesy of a person who hasn't decided yet whether to be hospitable. "Looking for a woman named Melissa Carter," the big one said. "Got reason to believe she's on this property." The kitchen went cold. Melissa didn't move. Her hand was flat on the counter, and she pressed it down hard like she was trying to anchor herself to the floor. Cole said, "Don't know that name." "That's so." The big man didn't believe it. His voice had no inflection when he didn't believe something which was somehow worse than aggression. "Her husband, Dale Carter, owes a significant sum to some significant people. Seeing as Mr. Carter has passed on—" The words hit Melissa in the sternum. Passed on. The world made a sound like static. "The debt transfers to next of kin. That'd be Mrs. Carter. Now we ain't unreasonable people. We're willing to discuss arrangements." Cole's voice stayed level. "I told you, I don't know the woman. And I'm telling you that your truck was seen outside a diner in Garfield 6 weeks ago. Same diner where a woman matching her description was seen. So." The big man looked at the house, looked directly at the kitchen window. "Why don't you let us have a word with whoever's inside and we can all go home happy?" Cole stepped sideways. One step, putting himself between the two men and the front of the house. "No one inside is available for conversation," he said. "I'm going to ask you to get back in your truck." The smaller man laughed. It was a short, practiced sound. "We got papers, legal papers, debts recorded and witnessed. You want to obstruct that you're looking at—" "I don't care what I'm looking at," Cole said. "Get back in your truck." Melissa was already moving. She came through the front door before her brain had finished authorizing it, because something older than reason, something that had been sitting at the base of her spine for 6 weeks waiting, said, "He should not be standing there alone because of you." She came down the porch steps and stood beside Cole. The big man looked at her. His expression shifted into something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was its cousin. "Mrs. Carter, my husband is dead," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Say that again so I hear it clearly." "Dale Carter died in an accident on a private rig outside Tulsa, March of this year." He said it without ceremony. "Surviving family is liable for outstanding debts under the terms of the private loan agreement he signed. That's $23,000. $23,000. The number didn't even process as real. It was too large, too abstract. It existed in a category of things that happened to other people." "He had no right to sign anything in my name," Melissa said. "He didn't sign in your name. He signed in his own name. And now he's dead, and you're next of kin." The big man reached into his jacket and produced a folded set of papers. "This is all documented." "What kind of arrangement?" Cole asked. The smaller man glanced at him. "What? You said you were willing to discuss arrangements. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" The two men exchanged a look. Not a fast look. A slow one, the kind that's a conversation. "The woman's able-bodied," the smaller one said finally. "Work arrangements can be made. There are operations." "Stop." Cole's voice dropped to something so quiet it almost didn't carry. "Stop talking." "Sir, I said stop." He turned his head and said at normal volume, without taking his eyes off the two men, "Earl." From around the side of the house, Earl appeared moving as fast as his bad back permitted, which was faster than Melissa had ever seen him move. He had a rifle. He carried it with the ease of a man for whom a rifle is a natural extension of a Tuesday morning. From the barn door, Dub materialized holding a shotgun across his forearms, not raised, not pointed, just present. The way Dub was always just present quietly, completely without drama. The big man's posture changed. Incremental, recalibrated. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I make mistakes all the time," Cole said. This ain't one of them. You're on my property making threats against people under my protection. You're going to get in your truck, and you're going to drive away, and you're going to go back to whoever sent you, and tell them that this matter will be handled through legal channels, or it will not be handled at all. Legal channels. The smaller man repeated it like it was a joke. I got a lawyer in Austin who will be very interested in a debt collected at gunpoint on private property, Cole said. That interested you. The big man folded his papers back up, slowly, taking his time with it, making sure everyone understood he was the one choosing to leave. This isn't finished, Mrs. Carter. Get off my land, Cole said. They got in the truck. Nobody moved until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then Earl let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere down in his boots. Lord have mercy. Melissa realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and looked at Cole and said the only thing she could say. He's dead. Yes, ma'am. Dale is dead. She said it again like she was testing whether it changed shape the second time. It didn't. He's been dead since March and nobody... She stopped, started again. He's been dead since March, and we were eating out of garbage cans. Cole didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. $23,000. She laughed, and it came out wrong, too sharp, too thin. He borrowed $23,000 from criminals, and then he died and left it to me and the children. That's... She stopped again. That is who he was. That is exactly who he was. Melissa. It was the first time Cole had used her name without the ma'am attached to it. She noticed. She filed it away somewhere careful. They're going to come back. I know. Not today, but they'll come back. I know that too. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way she'd learned to breathe when something was too large to process all at once. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I brought this to your door. You didn't bring anything, Cole said firmly. You got out of your truck and stood next to me. That's all you did. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And then from the porch came Emma's voice, and it was not the steady, controlled voice of a 12-year-old who has learned to manage herself. It was raw and high, and something inside it had finally broken. Every man, every single one. Melissa turned. Emma was standing on the porch, and she was shaking, and her face had the open, unguarded look of someone whose defenses have given out all at once. Sophie was behind her in the doorway, with both hands pressed over her mouth. Ben was next to Sophie, looking at Emma with wide, frightened eyes, because Ben had never seen his sister like this, and didn't know what it meant. Every man who was supposed to protect us, Emma said, and her voice broke on the word, protect, like a bone through skin, leaves us, or sells us, or disappears. She was looking at Cole, and the look had none of her usual calculation in it. It was just pain, pure and direct. Why should you be any different? Why should you be the one who actually stays? The question hit the yard like something physical. Cole walked to the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at Emma, and he didn't look away, and he didn't soften what he said with the kind of careful language people use when they're constructing something they don't fully mean. I don't know, he said. I can't prove anything to you in advance. I know that. You've been burned bad, and you got every right to stand right there and not trust a single word I say. He put one hand on the porch railing. All I can tell you is that right now today, I am not going anywhere. And tomorrow, I won't be going anywhere either. After that, he paused. After that, you'll know more than you know right now. Emma stared at him. Her chin was shaking. She was fighting it, but it was shaking. He's been dead since March, she said, and now the anger was dissolving into something softer and more terrible. Our daddy has been dead since March, and we didn't even... She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. We were eating garbage, and he was already gone. Cole climbed one step, stopped, let her decide the distance. Emma came down the rest of the steps and put her face in her hands and cried in a way Melissa had not heard from her eldest daughter in over a year. Not the silent crying Emma did in the dark when she thought no one could hear, but full, ugly, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Cole stood next to her and didn't touch her and didn't tell her to stop and didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He just stayed. Right there. Exactly there. Melissa came up behind her daughter and put both arms around her and held on. Sophie came off the porch and tucked herself under her mother's arm. Ben stood for a moment watching all of them trying to work out what a 5-year-old is supposed to do when the women in his life are breaking. Then he walked up to Cole, took the man's hand in both of his small ones, and held on. Cole looked down at the boy. Ben looked up at him. "Is the bad men gonna come back?" Ben asked. "They might try," Cole said honestly. "What'll happen if they do?" Cole's hand closed around Ben's. "Same thing that happened today." Ben nodded. This was a satisfactory answer. He kept holding on. Melissa looked at Cole over her daughter's shoulder, and she did not say the thing she was thinking, because she did not have words for it yet, and she wasn't sure she ever would. But she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't need language. Something that acknowledged what had just happened in this yard, and what it meant, and what it was going to cost both of them to figure out what came next. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Melissa sat on the porch alone. Cole came out an hour later and sat in the other chair without asking. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Melissa said quietly, "I have to tell you something." "All right." "I never stopped believing he might come back." She stared at the dark. "Even after everything, even when I was rational enough to know it didn't make sense, some part of me kept believing he'd come back and have some explanation that made it okay. That made it survivable." She paused. "Now he can't, and I don't know what to do with that." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't have to do anything with it tonight." The debt. The debt is a legal problem, and legal problems have solutions. Tonight, it's just grief. He looked at her. "You're allowed to just grieve tonight." She pressed her lips together hard. "He was my husband," she said. "He was a bad husband, but he was my husband and the father of those children, and he is dead, and I am sitting here, and I cannot for the life of me untangle what I feel from what I'm supposed to feel." "You don't have to," Cole said simply. "Feels messy because it is messy. That's not a character flaw. That's just human." Melissa turned and looked at him. This quiet, steady, confounding man sitting in the dark on his own porch, who had stood between her and armed collectors, and then sat down beside her daughter while she fell apart and held a 5-year-old's hand without flinching, and who was now telling her that grief is allowed to be complicated without requiring her to justify a single piece of it. She didn't have language for what she felt. She turned back to the dark. "Thank you," she said, "for today." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And they sat there together in the dark until the night got heavy around them, and the stars came out hard and bright, the way they only do in Texas, and neither of them moved to go inside, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else. And that silence was the most honest conversation Melissa Carter had had in over a year. The lawyer's name was Harlan Webb, and Cole had him on the phone by 7 the next morning. Melissa sat at the kitchen table and listened to one side of the conversation and tried to read what she could from Cole's face, which was not an easy thing to read under any circumstances. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, and he was writing things down with the focused economy of a man who doesn't waste motion numbers, names, short phrases she couldn't make out from across the table. Emma sat beside her mother. She'd come in at 6:30 without explanation and taken a chair and put her hands flat on the table, and that was all. Melissa hadn't asked her to leave. Emma had earned the right to be in this room. "What happens if she doesn't pay?" Cole said into the phone. Not a question, a prompt. He wrote something. "And if the original agreement wasn't witnessed by a notary?" He wrote something else. "What about the coercion angle? Coming onto private property, making threats in front of minors?" He listened for a moment. "Uh-huh. And that changes the..." He wrote faster. "All right. I'll have her call you directly this afternoon." He looked at Melissa across the table. "She's right here, Harlan. She's capable and she's sharp. You can talk to her straight." He listened again. A pause. Then something moved in his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "Yeah, I'll tell her that." He hung up and set the phone down. "Tell me what," Melissa said immediately. "He says the debt as described is on shaky legal ground to begin with. Private loan, no notary, no court filing. Dale signed his own name, not yours, which means enforcing it against you requires them to go through probate. That takes months and a judge." Cole set the legal pad in front of her. "It also requires them to be the kind of people who want to stand in front of a judge." Melissa stared at the notes. "You think they won't?" "I think men who collect debts by showing up on private property and talking about work arrangements are not generally enthusiastic about courtrooms." He tapped the pad. "Harlan wants to talk to you directly. He's going to send a letter to whatever address those men came from, making it clear this is now a legal matter. Most of the time that's enough." Emma had been reading the legal pad upside down with complete focus. "What if it's not enough?" Cole looked at her. "Then we deal with what's in front of us, same as everything else." "That's not a plan," Emma said. "No, it's a posture. Plans change, a posture holds." Emma absorbed this, filed it. "Okay," she said finally, which from Emma was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Harlan Webb's letter went out 2 days later. Certified mail, 3 pages. Melissa had read every word of it twice before she signed her name. And each page had felt like something being reclaimed. Her name on a legal document. Not as a liability, but as a person with standing with rights, with a lawyer who used words like harassment, and unlawful coercion, and civil remedy in the same sentence. She folded her copy and put it in the inside pocket of her good jacket, which she only took out of the garbage bag on important occasions. This qualified. 3 days after the letter, the black truck came back. Melissa heard it from inside the barn, where she'd been helping Sophie with the goat that had gotten its leg tangled in the fence. She came out into the yard with hay on her clothes and both hands dirty, and she did not go inside to make herself presentable, and she did not wait for Cole to come out first. She walked directly to the truck and stood in front of it while the engine was still running. The big man got out. He looked at her differently this time. Marginally. The way people look at you when a lawyer has recently written them a letter. "Mrs. Carter." "You received correspondence from my attorney," she said. "Everything that needs to be said between us is in that correspondence. If you have a response, it goes to him." "That's not quite how we prefer to." "I don't care how you prefer to operate." She held the man's gaze without blinking. "This is private property. You were told once to leave. My attorney has now formalized that in writing. The next time you set foot here, we will be calling the sheriff and filing a report that will go into your paper trail. Do you understand me?" The big man's jaw moved. He looked past her to where Cole had appeared on the porch and behind Cole Earl, with his rifle leaning against the railing in a posture of casual availability, and Dub in the barn doorway, and 2 trucks she didn't recognize, parked along the fence line with men she didn't know. Leaning against them with the quiet solidarity of people who have been asked to show up by someone they trust and have decided that's reason enough. Neighboring ranchers. Cole had called them. She hadn't known. She filed that away somewhere she planned to examine later. The big man looked at the assembled company. Then he looked back at Melissa. And for the first time since she'd seen him come out of that truck, she watched him do the math and come up with a number he didn't like. "This ain't finished," he said. "Yes, it is," Melissa said. "Go home." He got back in the truck. When it was gone, Earl started to clap, slow and deliberate 3 times, and it might have been a joke except his expression said it absolutely wasn't. Dub said nothing, but he nodded once in Melissa's direction, which she had come to understand was the equivalent of a lengthy formal commendation. Sophie burst out of the barn behind her and wrapped both arms around her mother's waist from the back, and said muffled into her shoulder, "That was the best thing I have ever seen in my entire life." Melissa stood in the yard with her daughter attached to her back, and her hands still dirty, and neighbors she'd never met looking at her with the uncomplicated approval of people who have recognized something worth recognizing. And she felt for the first time in over a year like herself. The actual herself. Not the diminished version that had been surviving, the one who had always been under there. Cole came down the porch steps and stopped in front of her. "You didn't need us," he said. A statement, not a question. "I needed all of you," she said honestly. "I just needed to say it myself first." He nodded, like that made complete sense. Because it did. The neighboring ranchers, 3 of them men who had known Cole for years, who had come when he called, because that's what you do in communities that still function. Like communities, stayed for coffee and sat around the kitchen table and were loud and normal, and asked Melissa how she made her cornbread without it coming out dry. And Earl got into a passionate argument with one of them about cattle feed, and Ben sat on the knee of the one named Garrett, who was approximately the size of a small building, and told him in precise detail about roping left-handed, and Garrett listened to every word. It was the most ordinary afternoon Melissa could remember in a very long time. It tasted like something she used to know. That night, after everyone had gone, and the children were in bed, and the kitchen was clean, Melissa stood at the sink and cried for the first time since she'd heard the words, "Dale Carter has passed on." Not from grief exactly. Or not only from grief. From the accumulated weight of all of it, the 14 months of holding the hunger, the dumpsters, the looks she'd been given in doorways, the night she'd stood in front of a mirror in a gas station bathroom and not recognized the woman looking back at her. It came out all at once, in the particular way that things do when the immediate crisis has passed, and the body finally understands it's allowed to put something down. She wasn't quiet about it. She couldn't be. Cole was still at the kitchen table with his legal pad. He didn't come to her. He didn't pat her shoulder or tell her it was okay. He just stayed at the table and said without looking up, "Take all the time you need." She did. When it was over, she washed her face at the sink and dried it and turned around. "I feel guilty," she said. He looked up then. "About being here. About the children being—" She gestured, not quite able to finish the sentence. "About feeling safe. About feeling—" She stopped again. "Dale is dead. He was a poor husband and a worse father, and he borrowed money from dangerous people and left his children to starve for it, and he is dead, and I am standing in a clean kitchen that isn't mine feeling—" Her voice broke on the next word, and she didn't say it. Didn't have to. Cole set his pen down. "The guilt you're feeling," he said carefully, "is your conscience making sure you're still a good person. It's doing its job. That doesn't mean it's telling you the truth about what you're allowed to have." Melissa looked at him. "I was married to him for 11 years. I know. I can't just—" She pressed her hands to the sides of her face briefly, the way she did when she needed to physically contain something. "I can't just decide it doesn't matter because things turned out hard." "Nobody's asking you to decide anything," Cole said. "You don't have to resolve it tonight. You don't have to resolve it next week. You just have to keep going, same as you've been doing." He held her gaze. "You're real good at that part, Melissa." Her name again. Without the ma'am. She was starting to understand that he only did it when he meant something by it, when there was weight behind what he was saying, that the formality would dilute. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Whatever this is, I don't know how." "Neither do I," he said. "We're doing all right so far." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat back down at the table and picked up the legal pad and looked at his notes without seeing them, and he picked up his pen and went back to what he'd been doing, and they sat there together in the quiet kitchen, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the most she'd had in longer than she could clearly remember. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before. Not faster, not slower, just differently. As if the whole ranch had exhaled. Emma began asking Cole about high school in the fall. Not if she could go, she'd assumed from the beginning that she was going, which Melissa recognized as the first genuinely childlike assumption her daughter had made in over a year. She was asking about which school, about what classes, about whether the library was decent. Cole drove her to the school in town and walked through it with her and answered every question she asked the librarian directly, and then took her for pie at the diner on Main Street, not the one with the dumpster, a different one, and came home and reported to Melissa that Emma had cross-examined the school librarian so thoroughly, that the woman had given her a library card on the spot out of sheer admiring resignation. "She's going to be something," Cole said. "She already is something," Melissa said. "Yes, ma'am. I mean, she's going to be something the rest of the world has to reckon with." Melissa allowed herself to feel proud of that. Really feel it in her chest without immediately cataloging all the ways things could still go wrong. Sophie had claimed one of the younger goats as her personal responsibility, a development nobody had officially sanctioned, but everyone had tacitly accepted. She named it Margaret. When Cole heard the name, he went very still for a moment, and then said quietly, "That's a good name for a determined animal." And Sophie had no idea why that mattered to him. And Melissa, watching from across the yard, understood exactly why, and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but held both of them inside it. Then came the morning that changed the temperature of everything. Ben had followed Cole out to the truck for the morning feed run, the way he always did. Chattering steadily, carrying one end of a feed sack that was clearly too heavy for him, but that he refused to relinquish. Cole took the other end without making a thing of it, and they loaded it together in the easy partnership of people who have done a task enough times to find their rhythm in it. Melissa was on the porch with her coffee when she heard Ben say, with the total lack of preamble that was his primary mode of communication, "Dad, Cole, can I go with you?" The yard went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Cole set his end of the feed sack down slowly. He turned and looked at the boy. Ben looked back at him with complete, uncomplicated expectation, the way 5-year-olds wait for answers when they don't understand they've said something significant. "What'd you call me?" Cole said. Ben considered. "Dad Cole," he said again with the slight emphasis of someone clarifying their terminology. "Because you're not my dad, but you're like a dad, so, Dad Cole." The silence stretched. Then Cole crouched down to Ben's level, the same smooth, easy motion he'd made that first day behind the diner, and he said very quietly, "Yeah, partner, you can come with me." Ben climbed in the truck immediately, already moving on the matter settled. Cole straightened up. He looked at the porch. He looked at Melissa. She had her coffee cup pressed to her mouth with both hands, and her eyes were doing something she couldn't stop them from doing. And she saw Cole see it, and she watched him look at her with something in his face that was wide open in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Something without guard or calculation, something that was just there, just real, just his. He touched the brim of his hat once. Got in the truck. She stood on the porch until the truck was gone. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and thought about a man who had handed her coffee on a porch step, who had put himself between her family and a rattlesnake, who had called his neighbors without being asked, and stood beside her while she faced down men who wanted to take everything, who had sat with her daughter while she fell apart, and held her son's hand, and never once put a price on any of it. She thought about Dale, who had promised her everything and delivered absence. She thought about what love had looked like when she was 22, and what it looked like now at 34, standing in another woman's kitchen with 3 children who were starting to sleep through the night and eat without anxiety and make noise again the way children are supposed to make noise. Love at 22 had looked like a big smile and words that came out easy. Love now looked like a man who noticed which hand her son favored, who learned her daughter's mind without flinching from it, who replaced a porch board before anyone asked, who stayed, who just kept staying. Emma came in from the back and found her mother at the table and stood in the doorway reading her face with those 12-year-old eyes that had learned to read everything. "What happened?" Emma asked. "Ben called him Dad Cole," Melissa said. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down. "Is that okay?" she asked. And the question was gentle, in a way Emma rarely allowed herself to be gentle, the edge of it, soft, asking something more than what the words said. Melissa looked at her eldest daughter. "I think," she said slowly, "that it might be the most okay thing that has happened to this family in a very long time." Emma looked at her hands on the table, looked up. "Mama, are you going to be all right?" "Yes," Melissa said, and she found saying it that she meant it, not as a brace against what might happen, not as a performance for her children's benefit. She meant it the way you mean something when the evidence has finally accumulated past the point where denial is reasonable. I think I really am. Emma nodded once the slow, serious nod she'd inherited from nobody Melissa could identify, and stood up and went to the stove to put the kettle on, with the practical purposefulness of a girl who has decided that the best response to an emotional moment is a useful action. Outside, somewhere down the drive, a truck horn sounded twice Ben's signal, which he'd developed without authorization that he was on his way back and dinner should be ready. Melissa stood up and started dinner. For the first time in over a year, she didn't count what was in the pantry before she did it. She just cooked. For the people who would be coming through that door hungry, who would sit at this table and be loud and take up space and need things from her that she was finding to her own astonishment that she still had left to give. She cooked and she didn't count. And outside the kitchen window, the Texas summer was beginning just barely to break. The heat broke in late September, not dramatically. Texas didn't do dramatic weather exits. It did slow retreats, the temperature dropping 1 degree at a time over 2 weeks, until one morning Melissa walked out to the porch and felt something different on her skin, and stood there for a moment placing it, before she recognized it as cool air. Actual cool air, the kind that carries the promise of something other than endurance. She stood on that porch and breathed it in, and felt it move through her like information. Inside, she could hear Ben telling Earl about a dream he'd had about horses that could talk, and Earl responding with complete seriousness, asking clarifying questions about what specifically the horses had said, and the sound of it. The ordinary, ridiculous domestic sound of a 5-year-old being taken seriously by a 63-year-old man with a bad back before 7 in the morning filled the house like light fills a room when you finally open the curtains. Cole came out and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee, the same way he had that first morning 6 weeks in, and handed her one without ceremony. "Broke," he said, meaning the heat. "Finally," she said. They drank their coffee. This was what they had become to each other over the past months. 2 people who could stand in the same silence and have it mean something rather than nothing, who had learned the particular vocabulary of each other's habits and moods without making a production of the learning. Melissa knew that Cole went quiet when he was worried about the cattle, not when he was angry. She knew he took his hat off indoors as a reflex of respect so ingrained it was muscle memory. She knew he kept Margaret's photograph on the nightstand, not as an altar, but as a conversation, a way of staying honest about who he'd been before and who he was becoming. Cole knew that Melissa cooked more food than the house could eat when she was anxious about something she couldn't fix. He knew she went over the ledger books late at night when she thought everyone was asleep, not to spy on him, but because understanding the numbers made her feel less like a guest and more like a person with standing. He knew she let herself laugh in the kitchen in ways she didn't let herself laugh anywhere else. The full, unguarded laugh that sounded like who she actually was underneath 14 months of necessary armor. He had stopped calling her ma'am sometime in August, and she had stopped noticing when. The call from Harlan Webb came on a Wednesday morning in October when Melissa was up to her elbows in bread dough, and Emma was at the kitchen table doing schoolwork that the town school had sent home because Emma had burned through the standard curriculum 3 weeks into the fall semester. And the teacher, a practical woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who knew a situation when she saw one, had arranged an accelerated independent program rather than waste everyone's time pretending otherwise. Cole handed Melissa the phone without wiping the flour off her hands first, because his expression said it was important, and she knew his expressions well enough by now to know the difference between kinds of important. "Mrs. Carter," Harlan Webb said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Satisfaction. "I have news." She braced herself anyway. "Tell me." The creditors withdrew the claim this morning. Full withdrawal. No further action, no negotiated settlement, no payment required. A pause. "Turns out, when you go looking into organizations like this one, you sometimes find that they have very strong reasons not to want a court to look back at them. Our inquiry shook a few trees. Things fell out." Another pause, and she could hear the smile in it. "Sometimes the law works the way it's supposed to, Mrs. Carter. Melissa stood in Cole's kitchen with flour on her hands and the phone against her ear and heard the sentence she hadn't let herself fully believe was coming. It was over. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out strange and flat because all the feeling in her was busy happening somewhere below language. "Thank Cole Bennett," Harlan said. "He's the one who made the calls that made this possible. You've got a good man in your corner, Mrs. Carter." She lowered the phone and stood very still. Emma had stopped writing. She was watching her mother's face with the focused attention she brought to everything important. "What happened?" Emma asked. "It's over," Melissa said. "The debt. All of it. They dropped it." Emma stared at her. Then she put her pencil down very deliberately, the way she did things when she was feeling something she wasn't going to display publicly, and she said, "Where's Cole? Barn, I think." Emma stood up, walked to the back door, opened it, and called out across the yard in a voice that had nothing 12-year-old about it. "Cole Bennett, get in here." A pause, then boots on the porch steps. Cole came in and took one look at the two of them and said, "Webb called." "You made calls," Melissa said. "Harlan said you made calls that changed this." Cole went to the counter and poured himself coffee like this was an ordinary moment. "I know some people who know some people, that's all." "That's not all, and you know it." She set the phone down on the counter. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it might not have worked," he said simply. "No point worrying you over something that might not land." Emma looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when Cole did something that restructured her understanding of what men were capable of. She'd been wearing it more frequently over the past several months, and each time Melissa saw it, she felt something shift incrementally in her chest, some further thawing of the thing that had been frozen in her daughter since the morning Dale drove away. "Thank you," Emma said with a gravity that made Cole set his coffee cup down and look at her directly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Emma said. "I want to. There's a difference." She held his gaze the way she held everyone's gaze. Unflinching, measuring, honest. "Thank you for protecting my family." The kitchen was very quiet. Cole said, "Yes, ma'am," which was what he said when something mattered too much for more words. Emma sat back down and picked up her pencil and went back to her work, and Melissa understood this was her daughter's way of giving them the room the same way she'd learned to read every gesture in this house over the past months. She looked at Cole. "I need to say something to you." "All right. You have done more for my children in 4 months than their father did in their entire lives, and I have been—" She stopped, breathed. "I have been treating that like a debt I owe you instead of like what it actually is." Cole frowned. "You don't owe me anything. That's not what this—" "I know that," she said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I know it's not about debt. I know you're not keeping score. But I've been living like you were because that's the only framework I had for understanding why a person would do what you've done. And I've been—" The word came out halted, but she made herself finish it. "I've been unfair to you, keeping you at arm's length because I was afraid if I let you be real to me, you'd turn out to be something else." Cole set his coffee cup down. "And?" he said quietly. "And you haven't," she said. "You just keep being exactly what you are, every single day." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know what to do with that yet, but I wanted you to know I see it." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." November came in with the smell of wood smoke and dry grass, and the ranch settled into the rhythm of the cooler months, the way it had clearly been settling into this rhythm for years. The cattle moved, the work changed character. The evenings came earlier and gathered everyone inside sooner. Earl's back improved in the cold in ways it never did in the heat, and he moved around the place with something approaching ease. And Melissa noticed he'd started humming in the mornings, some tuneless thing that had no beginning and no end, just the sound of a man who has found his equilibrium. Dub had, with no announcement and no discussion, begun leaving an extra chair at the dinner table, not for any particular person, just there available as if he were constructing in furniture What couldn't easily be said in words, there is room here. There will be room. The evening that cracked everything open. The rest of the way came in mid-November, cold and clear. The sky doing what the Texas sky does in fall, going so deep and dark and full of stars that it stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like a statement. Melissa was on the porch. Cole came out and sat in the other chair, and for a while, neither of them said anything, and then from inside came a sound that made them both go still. Ben's voice. Singing. Tunelessly freely, the same way Sophie sang when she forgot to be careful. And underneath it, Sophie's voice joining in, and then Emma's. The three of them singing something that wasn't quite any song that existed, but was built from pieces of several songs, the way children build things from whatever's available, without worrying about whether it's correct. Cole and Melissa sat on the porch and listened to their children sing. Neither of them commented on the word that had just arranged itself quietly in Melissa's mind. Their children. She let it sit there. Turned it over once. Didn't put it back. "I need to ask you something," Cole said. "All right." He was looking at the stars, not at her, which she had learned meant he was choosing his words with particular care. "I've been thinking about the spring. The ranch has a good year coming if the water table recovers, and the market holds, and Earl thinks it will. I've been thinking..." He paused. "I've been thinking about restructuring the operation, bringing in a kitchen and supply component. Selling locally farmers markets, the kind of thing that requires someone who knows food and knows how to run a household operation with real efficiency." He stopped again. "I'd want it to be a real partnership. Legal, documented, yours in writing." Melissa turned her head and looked at him. He was still looking at the stars. "It would mean staying," he said. "If you wanted to, if that was something you wanted." The porch was quiet. "Cole," she said. He looked at her then. "Are you offering me a business partnership?" she said slowly. "Or are you being so careful about not scaring me off that you've buried the actual thing you're trying to say underneath a business proposal?" Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Something unguarded and brief and almost young. "Both," he said. "Probably both." "Probably." She looked at him for a long time. At the face she'd been learning for 4 months, the particular lines of it, the way it held things without broadcasting them. The way it softened in specific moments that he didn't know she'd catalogued. The face of a man who had run toward her daughter's scream, who had stood between her family and armed men, who had called his neighbors without being asked and held a 5-year-old's hand and told a 12-year-old that her questions deserved real answers, who had waited, who had been so patient and so still that she'd almost mistaken it for indifference, and then one day understood it was the opposite, that it was the most deliberate and complete kind of care, the kind that doesn't push, that doesn't present its bill, that just stays in the same place and lets you find your way to it when you're ready. "The business proposal," she said carefully, "is a good one, and I would want it in writing." Cole nodded once. "The other thing," she said, "is going to take me some time." "I know," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know you're not." She looked back at the stars. "That's exactly why I'm still sitting here." They sat in the comfortable silence that had become its own kind of language between them, and inside the house the singing went on, and the wood stove clicked, and the ranch settled around all of them like something that had been waiting for this configuration for a long time, and had simply been patient enough to let it arrive. The partnership papers were drawn up in December and signed in Harlan Webb's office on a Thursday afternoon with all 3 children present, because Melissa Carter did not make decisions that affected her family without her family in the room. Ben drew on the back of a spare legal pad the entire time. Sophie asked Harlan 3 questions about how contracts worked and received answers that were clearly more detailed than he'd planned to give, offered up by a lawyer who recognized the specific quality of a mind that wasn't going to accept a simplified version. Emma read every page of the document before her mother signed it, and when she'd finished, she looked up at Harlan and said, "The liability clause in Section 4 needs to be clearer about what constitutes a shared expense." And Harlan stared at her for a moment, and then got out his pen and made the change. On the way back to the ranch, Cole drove and Ben sat in the middle of the bench seat, and Melissa sat at the window, and Emma and Sophie were in the back, and somewhere around the 3rd mile, Sophie announced that Margaret the goat had been behaving strangely, and she believed babies were coming, and the rest of the drive was occupied entirely by an urgent and logistically complex discussion of goat midwifery, in which everyone participated with complete commitment, and Cole provided expertise from a rancher's perspective that Sophie received with the focused attention of a girl who intended to be ready. Margaret had 3 kids by morning. Sophie named them immediately precisely, and without consulting anyone the way people name things they've already decided belong to them. Christmas came to the Bennett Ranch the way it comes to places that have learned what it actually means, not with abundance or excess, but with presence. Melissa made pie from scratch 3 kinds, and Earl cried openly at the table when he tasted the first one, and said it was exactly how his mother used to make it, and he hadn't tasted anything like it in 30 years, and nobody made him feel strange about it, and that was its own kind of gift. Ben got a rope, a real one, left-handed, fitted from Cole, with a note in Cole's careful handwriting that said, "For Ben Carter, who has the best pull in 3 counties." He read the note 4 times, and then folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket, and wore it there all day. Emma got a set of books from Harlan Webb, sent without announcement, without a card. Just a package with a list of titles that tracked from introductory law through the first year of a pre-law curriculum, and a brief note at the bottom that said, "For when you're ready. You already think like one." Emma set the package on the table and looked at it for a full minute without speaking, which for Emma was the equivalent of breaking down entirely. On the evening of the last day of December, when the year was hours from closing, Melissa stood on the porch in the cold and watched the dark and thought about where she had been 12 months ago. The alley behind a diner. The dumpster. Ben's hands wrapped around a piece of rotten bread like it was something precious, because to him that day it was. The distance between that moment and this one felt like the distance between 2 different lifetimes. Cole came out and stood beside her. "You all right?" he asked. "I was thinking about the diner," she said. He was quiet. "I was thinking about how I almost didn't come," she said. "When you drove down the road, I almost didn't start walking." "What made you start?" She thought about it honestly the way she did most things now. "Emma," she said. "Emma said you looked at Ben's face before you looked at anything else, and she said that mattered." She paused. She was 12 years old, and she knew more about what to look for in a man than I did. "She's extraordinary," Cole said. "She is." Melissa looked out at the dark. "They all are. They were always extraordinary. Nobody ever told them." Cole turned to look at her profile. Somebody raised them to be. She pressed her lips together, felt the truth of it settle. "I thought losing everything meant God had abandoned us," she said. It was what she'd been thinking since September, since the heat broke, since she'd started being able to see the shape of what her life had become. "I thought there was something wrong with us, something that meant we didn't deserve." She stopped. "You know that's not true now," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "I'm learning it's not true," she said. "That's different. That takes longer." She looked at him. "But I'm learning it." He reached over in the dark and found her hand and held it without making a thing of it. Just held on warm and steady and certain the way he did everything. She looked down at their joined hands and then back up at the stars, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the big promises, not the easy words. This. A man standing beside you in the cold holding your hand like it's simply where his hand belongs. "Maybe losing everything," she said slowly, "is how some people finally find where they're supposed to be." Cole squeezed her hand once. Inside the house, through the warm-lit window, she could see all of it. Emma at the table with her new books already reading, already somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow yet. Sophie on the floor with 3 baby goats she had absolutely brought inside, against all reasonable expectation, and no one had found the will to stop her. Ben asleep in the armchair with his rope still in his hand and his note still in his shirt pocket, dreaming probably about horses. Earl and Dub at the table playing cards with the slow contentment of men who have found their people and stopped looking. The kitchen that had been one woman's and was now another's. The table that had been missing its people and had finally found them. The house that had been quiet for 3 years and had learned in 4 months to be loud again. Melissa Carter was not rich. She was not perfect. She still woke some nights reaching for the thread of anxiety that had held her together for 14 months, still had to remind herself some mornings that stability is allowed to last. She was still overweight in a world that wanted her to apologize for it, still learning to occupy her own space without calculating whether she deserved it. But her daughter was going to be a lawyer. Her son knew the name of every horse on the ranch and slept with his rope in his hand because tomorrow there was more to learn, and he did not want to waste any of the morning getting ready for it. Her middle child had named 3 goats and brought them inside, and nobody had said a word, because this family had discovered sometime in the past 4 months that the things worth fighting for are usually the things that don't make any practical sense. And beside her in the dark was a man who had walked out a back door in July and looked at her son's face and said quietly that no child should eat like that in America. Who had meant it? Who had spent every day since proving he meant it? Who was still here? Melissa Carter stood on the porch in the first cold of a new year with her hand in his, and she looked at the window full of light and noise and living. And she understood with the full weight of a woman who had survived everything that had been thrown at her and come out the other side, still standing, still whole, still herself. That home is not the place you come from. Home is the place where someone finally sees you, clearly, all of you. Every difficult and complicated and imperfect inch and stays anyway. She had found it at the bottom of a dumpster in a Texas summer, and she had almost walked away from it, and she had not. That choice. The one Emma had talked her into without knowing, that's what she was doing, standing in the gravel outside a roadside diner, telling her mother that a man who looks at a hungry child before he looks at anything else is probably the man he says he is. That single choice had given her children back their childhood, given her back herself, and given all of them something she had stopped believing existed, a life worth waking up for. And they were going to live it. Every single day. They were going to live it.